A cold evening in New York City. The streets of New York City buzz with life. The sound of car horns mixed with the chatter of pedestrians racing to their destinations. The air was sharp and cold, carrying the familiar scent of roasted peanuts and hot dogs from nearby food stalls. It felt like any other ordinary evening, but the city had its secrets, as it always did. On the sidewalk near the subway entrance, a woman sat alone. Her coat was worn and her hands were wrapped tightly around a small paper coffee cup, the steam rising to meet her face. Her name was Eleanor. She had the kind of tired look that came from years of hardship, but there was something else in her gaze: determination. Eleanor was a veteran. Once she had proudly worn her uniform, serving her country with honor. But life after service had proven to be a struggle. She'd lost her job, her home, and much of the support network that had once felt unshakable. Her days were unpredictable. One day, she could find food and a warm bed. The next, she could not. Her life was a constant battle to survive, but through it all, she held on to a dream: to rebuild her life and to one day give back to others who found themselves in similar situations. On the other side of the city, in a tall glass building that gleamed under the dim glow of the streetlights, Donald Trump sat at his desk. His office, a symbol of wealth and influence, was worlds apart from the cold streets Eleanor called home. Trump was a businessman and a former political leader, well known for his bold moves and sharp decisions. Yet today, he found himself distracted. A recent discussion about homelessness had lingered in his mind. Numbers, reports, and statistics swam in his head. But it wasn't just numbers, it was the faces behind those numbers that stayed with him. Trump's life was orderly, planned, and structured. Yet his thoughts were now focused on a problem that had the power to disrupt his perspective. Eleanor, in her own quiet way, was fighting battles that he couldn't ignore. The two had never met, but tonight, their paths would cross in a way neither could have imagined. Life has a way of connecting very different people at the most unexpected moments. Their meeting that evening would spark a chain of events neither of them could predict. It would change their lives, and the lives of countless others, forever. A chance encounter that changed everything. Eleanor sat on the cold pavement, her back pressed against the brick wall near the subway entrance. The freezing air nipped at her face, and her hands shook as she clutched a small cardboard sign that read, "Veteran in need, anything helps." Her coffee cup was a dull reminder of her reality, half full with a few coins, none enough to buy a warm meal. The streets around her were alive with movement. People hurried past without a glance, their eyes focused on their destinations or their phones. Eleanor felt invisible, like she was just part of the city's background noise. She had tried everything, finding odd jobs, looking for shelters, but the days always seemed the same. The struggle felt endless. A few blocks away, Donald Trump was riding in his sleek black car after a long day of meetings and speeches. His mind was still processing the day's events, deals, decisions, strategy. His schedule had been overwhelming, and he was looking forward to returning home. His driver brought the car to a halt at a red light. As he sat back, looking out the window, something caught his attention. Near the edge of the sidewalk, just off the glow of the streetlight, he saw her. A woman sitting alone, wearing worn clothes and clutching the paper cup. Her sign caught his attention: "Veteran in need." There was something about her, the way she sat there, her expression, the cold in her eyes, that made him pause. It wasn't just a passing glance. "Stop the car," he said, his voice clear and sharp. His driver obeyed, pulling to the side of the street. Trump stepped out of the car and approached her. Eleanor looked up as he neared, startled. She wasn't used to people stopping, especially not someone like him. Her heart raced. "What happened to you?" he asked directly, his voice calm. Eleanor hesitated, unsure whether she could trust him. But there was something in the way he spoke, genuine concern, not the type of tone she'd learned to ignore. She took a deep breath and began to speak. Her voice was shaky as she shared her story. How she had once proudly served in the military, how her life had taken a turn for the worse after returning home, and how she had struggled for years to find stability. She told him about losing her job, her home, and the daily fight just to survive. Trump listened without interrupting, his gaze focused and thoughtful. When she finished, he stood there quietly for a moment before nodding. Wait here, he said and turned back toward his car. Eleanor sat frozen, unsure if he would actually come back. Most people ignored her, walking past without even a second thought. But a moment later, he returned, not empty-handed, but with a coat and a small bag of food. He handed them to her. "This is just the start," he said. His words felt simple but powerful, as though they held a promise. Eleanor's hands trembled as she accepted the coat and the food. A surge of emotion came over her, surprise, relief, and a small spark of hope. She didn't know yet how much this simple act of kindness would change her life, but in this moment, she felt the first glimmer of something better. It was just a small gesture, but for Eleanor, it was the first step toward a new life. New challenges and unspoken doubts. The morning after her encounter with Trump felt different for Eleanor. The coat he gave her the night before kept her warm, and the food had finally settled the gnawing hunger in her stomach. As she stood in the cold, staring at the subway entrance, a question lingered. Could her life really change? But doubt was familiar, and years on the streets had taught her to be cautious. Dreams felt fragile when survival was always just a step away. Trump, on the other hand, couldn't shake Eleanor from his mind. Her story stayed with him, the pain in her voice and the look in her eyes lingering in his thoughts. That morning, he decided to take action. He set up a meeting with Sarah, a young woman who had dedicated her life to helping homeless veterans by running a small, struggling shelter. Sarah had a passion for helping others, but constantly struggled with limited resources and funding. Trump knew that her experience could make a difference. During their meeting, he asked Sarah if she could locate Eleanor and see if she would accept additional help. With a small team, Sarah began her search. Days on the streets had taught Eleanor to trust no one. When Sarah first approached her, she wasn't sure what to make of the stranger. But when Sarah mentioned Trump's name, Eleanor listened. "He sent me," Sarah said. "We can help you. There's a warm meal and a safe place waiting at the shelter." At first, Eleanor hesitated. She wasn't sure if she deserved another chance or if this was just another false promise. But her instincts told her to try. When she arrived at the shelter, she found herself in a space filled with other veterans who shared their struggles and triumphs. For the first time in years, Eleanor didn't feel completely alone. But life has a way of throwing challenges when hope feels close. While things began to look better for Eleanor, tension brewed behind the scenes. Trump's inner circle wasn't fully on board with his efforts. Some of his advisors thought helping a single person was a waste of resources and time. Mark, one of Trump's longtime advisors, was especially vocal about his concerns. "This isn't the kind of thing that builds support, Mr. President," Mark warned. "We got bigger priorities." Trump listened, but the image of Eleanor's weary eyes and her determination haunted him. He wasn't willing to give up. "Sometimes the smallest things make the biggest difference," he said to Mark, a statement that left his advisor silent but unconvinced. At the shelter, Eleanor was also facing her own battles. Some of the other veterans viewed her with suspicion. She wasn't sure if they trusted her, and that uncertainty gnawed at her. One man named Jim, who had been in the shelter for months, openly confronted her one day. "You're taking resources meant for others," he told her, his voice sharp. The words stung. Eleanor had spent years fighting for survival, but now even here, the doubts seemed to follow her. She began to withdraw, unsure if she belonged or deserved the help being offered. Sarah noticed the change and tried her best to encourage Eleanor. She told her, "Everyone deserves a second chance, no matter how hard their journey has been." Meanwhile, Trump was navigating his own storm. His advisors continued to pressure him to step back from the issue. News about his efforts to help Eleanor was beginning to stir up mixed reactions. Some viewed his actions as noble, while others called them a distraction or a political move. The media had already begun focusing on the story. Adding fuel to the fire, a local news station aired a report highlighting Trump's involvement with Eleanor. The segment was sharp, with some reporters accusing Trump of using her situation for publicity. The backlash grew, dividing his team further. It wasn't just about helping one person anymore. It was about political image, public perception, and trust. Eleanor felt that pressure too. Even though she wanted to believe in the change, the negative attention made her feel guilty. Was she just a problem that needed to go away? She thought. She stood at a crossroads, unsure if she should step aside and let Trump move on, or if she should fight for herself, for the hope he had given her. As these challenges unfolded, both Trump and Eleanor found themselves in situations that would force them to confront their fears, their values, and their goals. What started as a simple act of kindness would soon become a test of strength, faith, and perseverance. Both of them would learn that the hardest paths lead to the greatest victories. But first, they had to decide if they would take that step. The moment of truth. Eleanor's story had gone from a quiet conversation on the streets of New York to making headlines across the country. News stations, online articles, and social media posts were buzzing with her name and Trump's efforts to help her. Some people were inspired, seeing her as a symbol of hope, a reminder that change is possible with compassion and determination. Others were quick to dismiss the story, accusing Trump of using it as a publicity stunt and questioning whether Eleanor deserved the help. The attention felt overwhelming. The shelter where Eleanor now stayed became a hub for reporters and photographers. Cameras followed her every move, and microphones were constantly shoved into her face. Some questions felt intrusive, as if they were trying to unravel her past and expose her for struggling the way she did. One journalist even found records of her military service and asked her directly why. After all she had accomplished, she ended up living on the streets. These constant questions wore her down. She began to feel as though every part of her life, every choice, every struggle was being scrutinized. Eleanor felt trapped, as though the media had made her life not just a story but a trial. Meanwhile, Trump's leadership team was cracking under pressure. His advisors debated whether continuing to stand by Eleanor was the right move. Mark, his most vocal advisor, had been especially critical. "This isn't worth it, Mr. President," he said during one heated meeting. "There are more important things to focus on. Your time, your image. This could backfire." Trump sat in his office, listening to his team's doubts. He felt the weight of their arguments, but when he thought about Eleanor, the way her eyes had looked at him that night, the way she had trusted him with her story, it solidified his resolve. He knew this wasn't about politics. It was about something deeper. If helping one person makes a difference, then it's worth it, he told himself. At the shelter, Eleanor was facing her own kind of betrayal. Jim, a man who had once welcomed her and apologized for his initial doubts, had begun to listen to the same media stories that painted Eleanor in a negative light. He confronted her one afternoon, his voice cold. "Maybe they're right," Jim said, his words cutting through the air. "Maybe you are just using this for yourself." Those words stung more than she could explain. She had come so far, and now doubt had started to creep back into her mind. Eleanor thought about leaving, disappearing, and letting the world think what it wanted. But Sarah, the young woman who had welcomed her into the shelter and believed in her, reminded her of something important. "You've made it this far, Eleanor. Don't let fear take away the chance you've been given," Sarah said, her voice firm but encouraging. Those words stayed with Eleanor. She thought about how far she had come and how much strength she'd already summoned. Running away would only give the doubters power over her. With that in mind, she knew what she had to do. She had to face the world and share her story, even if it meant the possibility of rejection or judgment. At the same time, Trump made his choice. He ignored Mark's concerns and continued his support. He stood by his belief that helping even one person could inspire hope. During a press conference, he made his stance clear. If helping one person makes a difference, then it's worth it. The moment of truth came as Eleanor stood at a podium during a live press event. Her hands shook as she gripped the microphone. The weight of judgment and doubt threatened to crush her. But as she looked at the crowd in front of her and the cameras flashing, she chose strength. Her voice was hesitant at first, but it grew stronger as she spoke about her journey, her time in the military, her struggles, her mistakes, and her hopes for the future. She didn't hide from her pain or try to justify herself. Instead, she told the truth, speaking openly about fear, failure, and the power of second chances. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice steady now. "This is about all the people out there who have struggled, who have felt forgotten, and who think that their mistakes define their future. They don't. You can start over, even when it feels impossible." The room grew quiet. People listened. There was no anger in her words, just courage, raw and genuine. Eleanor wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for hope, for strength, for proof that anyone can rise from the ashes of their worst moments. Trump watched her from the sidelines, knowing this was a pivotal moment. She wasn't just telling her story. She was showing the world what it meant to stand tall in the face of doubt. The press event became more than just a story about one woman and one public figure. It was a story about perseverance, belief, and what it truly means to stand up for the smallest, most fragile glimmer of hope. The battle wasn't over, but in that moment, Eleanor had taken the first step. And sometimes that's all it takes to change everything. A new chapter for Eleanor. After Eleanor shared her story with the world, things began to shift. She spoke openly about her struggles, her time in the military, and how difficult it had been to start over. Her honesty resonated with people far and wide. Messages of encouragement flooded the shelter. Some came with donations, others with kind words and offers of help. It was a relief to know that, for once, she wasn't invisible. Trump's choice to stand by her also sparked a movement. His decision to put his focus on Eleanor's story shined a spotlight on the challenges many veterans face after service. Critics still debated his motives, accusing him of using her story for political gain. However, many others praised his willingness to use his platform to raise awareness about the struggles of homeless veterans. The atmosphere at the shelter started to change. The tension that had once made many veterans skeptical of Eleanor began to fade. They saw her for who she really was, a fighter, a survivor, and someone who had endured far more than many could imagine. One evening, as the sun was setting, Jim approached her. His expression was serious but sincere. "I was wrong," he admitted, his voice quiet. "You're stronger than I gave you credit for." Eleanor looked at him, unsure of how to respond. His words hurt, but they also gave her a sense of closure. She nodded, accepting his apology but not erasing how deeply his doubts had affected her. It was a reminder that healing isn't just about finding new hope. It's about learning to trust people again, even when the scars of doubt linger. Sarah, who had become a source of steady support for Eleanor, noticed the changes too. She could see a new kind of determination in Eleanor's eyes, a spark that hadn't been there just a few weeks earlier. Eleanor began helping out more at the shelter. She would spend her mornings talking to other veterans, offering advice and encouragement, and sharing what had helped her survive. Her confidence grew with every small step, and it felt empowering to take control of her journey, even in tiny ways. But things weren't always easy. Media attention still hovered, and not everyone believed in her story. Some people continued to question her motives, and Eleanor learned how to block out the negative voices. She couldn't control the opinions of others, but she could control her own path. As hard as it was, she chose to focus on her actions and the people who believed in her. Meanwhile, Trump was busy turning his inspiration into action. His meetings with groups focused on veterans grew in purpose and intensity. Inspired by Eleanor's courage, he began advocating for programs that would help homeless veterans find housing, work, and the support they needed to rebuild their lives. During the meeting, he stated, "This is only the beginning." It wasn't a magic fix or an instant solution, but it was a start. His commitment showed that real change could come from understanding and action. For Eleanor, the aftermath wasn't about sudden wealth or a perfect new life. It was about taking small, deliberate steps toward change. Every meal she shared with another veteran at the shelter, every story she shared, and every moment of hope was a step in the right direction. Yes, fear still lingered, but so did possibility. For the first time in a long time, Eleanor could see a future for herself, a life not defined by her mistakes or struggles, but by her strength and willingness to try again. The world didn't change overnight, and there were still challenges ahead. But Eleanor had found something essential. Her voice mattered. She could see that, despite the doubts and hardships, every step forward brought her closer to building something better for herself and others. And that was enough. A new beginning for Eleanor months later. Eleanor's life was a world away from the cold, lonely nights on the streets of New York City. With Sarah's guidance and support, she had moved into a small apartment near the shelter. It wasn't grand or flashy, but it was hers, a safe, warm space that felt like a fresh start. Eleanor found joy in the simple things, the sound of her own keys in the lock, the smell of her first cup of coffee in the morning, and the comfort of knowing she had a place to rest her head. Most importantly, it gave her the strength to focus on rebuilding her life, one small step at a time. Helping others through experience. Eleanor had started volunteering at the shelter, using her experiences to connect with other veterans. Many of them found comfort in talking to her because she truly understood their struggles. She listened without judgment, shared advice, and pointed them toward resources that could help them get back on their feet. To her, every conversation mattered, whether it was helping someone find their first warm meal in days or offering encouragement to someone on the brink of giving up. "It's not about fixing everything at once," Eleanor often said. "It's about showing up and making a difference in small ways." Trump's continued commitment. Donald Trump stayed involved in this effort, working with Sarah and other groups to develop programs focused on housing, job training, and mental health services for veterans. He learned firsthand that real change often started with personal connections and persistence. Eleanor became one of the voices representing these efforts. She spoke at events, shared her story with people who needed to hear it most, and stood as a symbol of what was possible when one person took a chance on change. The media eventually stopped covering her story. It didn't bother her. Eleanor had stopped worrying about public opinions and judgment. Instead, she focused on what mattered most, the victories that couldn't be measured by headlines. Every smile from a veteran who found work after years of struggle, every bit provided on a cold night, and every moment spent supporting someone in need felt like a win. Personal growth and strength. Eleanor had grown in ways she never imagined. She was no longer defined by the mistakes of her past or the hardships she'd endured. She had learned that asking for help didn't make her weak. It made her brave. It had taken time, but she found strength in learning to trust again and in giving herself the space to heal. She also discovered that her voice mattered. Sharing her journey wasn't just about her own recovery. It was about helping others believe in the possibility of change, too. Her courage had given hope to those still fighting to find their way. Trump's reflection on leadership. Trump's involvement with Eleanor and her story taught him something important about leadership. It wasn't always about big projects, flashy plans, or grand speeches. True leadership, he realized, was about caring for individuals and showing up for them when it mattered most. He learned that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can lead to the greatest changes. A story of resilience and hope. In the end, Eleanor's journey was about more than a change in circumstances. It was a journey of rediscovery, strength, and faith in second chances. She proved that no matter how far someone has fallen, it's never too late to start over. Her story was a testament to what hope and determination could achieve, how one person's courage could light the way for many others. Eleanor had faced her fears, stood up for herself, and inspired change. She learned that even when the world feels uncertain, small actions can ripple into powerful transformations. And in that understanding, she found freedom, purpose, and hope.